You have it? Okay. Okay.
Is that different?
Just a second. I see most of the commission members are in the room. Not just back.
They kept us together. They moved us on the other side of the track.
So for those commission members, please, I'm going to go ahead and have Karen go ahead and do the roll call if you're in the back, and if you would still shout out that you're here, please. Madam Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. Dennis Bland. John Conan. John Costas. Jed Fisher.
Here.
Lisa Hirschman. Here. Alan Hubbard.
Here.
Chris Lameau.
Here.
Micah Mosier. Here. Chris Murphy.
Here.
Dan Peterson.
Here.
Beverly Pitts. John Pop.
Here.
Alfonso Vidal.
Here.
Karen Whitehouse. Here. We have a quorum, Mr. Chairman.
Strong quorum. Almost unanimous. So thank you all for being here with us today. This meeting is officially called to order. Number one, we've done this a couple times, but I want to take this opportunity on behalf of all the commission members to again thank Chancellor Keon and his entire staff for a great day and a half here. We really appreciate all the hospitality and the beautiful facilities, the tour, the conversation, the wonderful food and music last night. So really, really appreciate it. It's been a great visit. So thank you very much. A couple other comments from my chair position. Number two, John Conan. Dr. Conan has been with us for a couple of years, and it's with very mixed emotions that we are bidding adieu to him as he moves through his term. So John has been a fantastic commission member on so many levels, and we really appreciate your level of thought and commitment to the discussions that we have, representing the position of faculty very, very well, helping us understand and make sure we're taking those issues into account very well, and been a fantastic commission member. So we've got a good run of the commission members, going from student commission members to faculty commission members. So both of you continue to raise the bar. So a new faculty commission member has not yet been appointed from the governor's office. We're expecting that soon, I believe, but hopefully in July we'll have that name. But we would like to, beyond just these comments, recognize John for his service, and we have a resolution, I believe, that Dennis is going to read to do so.
And thank you, and it is an honor to do so. Resolution honoring John Conan. Whereas John Conan provided strong faculty representation to the Commission for Higher Education since his appointment in February 2015. Whereas John was actively engaged in the development of the Commission's budget recommendations for the 2017 to 2019 biennium. And whereas he helped shape the Commission's strategic vision as expressed in the most recent update to the Commission's strategic plan, Reaching Higher, Delivering Value. And whereas Professor Conan participated in 3 age welding conferences for higher education, and whereas during this time Dr. Conan discharged his duties with distinction and impartially advocated for the students and faculty at Indiana's public institutions of higher education, and whereas he successfully planned and hosted an exceptionally well-attended and well-received faculty leadership conference in February entitled Classroom to Career, Integrating Career-Ready Skills into the Course Curriculum, and whereas John has been a conscientious and faithful member of the Academic Affairs and Quality Committee, later becoming chair of the committee, now therefore be it resolved that the Commission for Higher Education expresses its deep appreciation to John Conan for his 2.5 years of dedicated service as the faculty representative to the Commission for Higher Education and to the state of Indiana, and wishes him well as he continues his teaching and administrative duties as chair of the Department of Economics at Indiana State University.
Wonderful, very, very well written. I think we probably want to go ahead and make this official by voting on it. Thank you very much. Unanimous move, I'm sure. And just to be formal, a second?
Second.
All right, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, say. Thank you. I would open it up. John, any comments from you, or certainly would love to open it up to comments from fellow commission members as well.
Well, let me just say that I spent my entire adult life in higher education, and so all the issues that have come before the commission have been incredibly interesting to me. But I couldn't have predicted the quality of the commission and the people that serve here, and I'm so impressed and so grateful for the privilege to serve with you. It's been amazing, and Teresa, the wonderful staff that you've put together, everyone here has made the last 2.5 years incredibly enjoyable. I thank you for the privilege of being able to serve.
I think we benefit from having an economist on the commission.
Those people don't say that.
Thank you. I know, that's why I say
An economist.
Well, I think we've benefited from your economic prowess, but from in so many other ways. You've been a fantastic partner with all of us, and really appreciated your time and commitment and working together, learning from each other. Much appreciated. So, hope we don't lose touch. Yeah, we'll make every effort to keep it going. So, thank you. All right. Unless there's any other remarks, we have the great pleasure of having President Daniels here with us today, and we enjoyed hearing from him a little bit over lunch, and certainly appreciate him spending time with us and doing a few minutes with us here today. So please help me welcome President Mitch Daniels.
Thank you, and welcome to Purdue Northwest, Indiana's 5th largest public university. Now you understand why we're so proud of this facility and its leadership and its students. Let me try to be additive and not redundant, the things that you know covered in some detail this morning. Let me start with just a quick framing. 148 years ago, Purdue University was created as Indiana's land-grant school with a very specific assignment to open the gates of higher education beyond the wealthy, the privileged, and the elite. And that's a mission that we pursued proudly for all the intervening years. A little over half a century ago, that was our configuration was deemed not adequate to the growing challenge to teach not only returning veterans, but a much broader swath of the population. And we opened what became Purdue Northwest, Purdue Fort Wayne, and IU opened its own regional campuses, and that was the next wave of what could be called the democratization of higher ed, and a very noble undertaking. In the 20th century, let alone the 19th century, we all know it was not necessary for an individual to have a post-secondary degree or credential of some kind to prosper and lead a life of full potential. Today it is. And in the 20th century, let alone the 19th century, society did not need a large majority of its adults to have that level of education in order to be a successful nation and civil society and economy. Today we do. And therefore, Purdue is hardly the first institution to recognize that America needs that next concentric growth, that next round of democratization of higher education. As we were discussing at lunch, one can reflect back and conclude that the advance of this country has been driven by education more than any other factor, and that we've done it by constantly educating the young cohort better than each young cohort better than the one before. And as one generation left working life, they were replaced by a new younger group that was better prepared for the society and economy of the day. That's not fast enough anymore. In a world that is changing as rapidly as this one, that's not enough. And we have to have the best undergraduate education for the traditional student but we also have to find a way to reach those who missed out the first time. If we're going to be the state that we aspire to be, and the nation we aspire to be. So, with that as a preface, let me just take you through the thought process that led to the transaction we've just effected with Kaplan University. We thought it boiled down to three realities. There are millions, there are 750,000 in this state, 36 million Americans who started college and didn't finish. To me, still an astonishing number. Secondly, the tools of the internet, and as they apply to education, are growing very rapidly in both reach and sophistication. We don't know how fast that'll be, we don't know all the forms it'll take, but it's only going one direction, and quickly. And we faced up at Purdue a third reality, which is we didn't think we could build it ourselves. We're not built to do that, we're not quick enough, we're way behind to start with, and we thought that if we wanted to meet our mission and be prepared for a very different future, we needed to at least be open to the possibility of bringing into our university skills we don't have now. Nobody's been, that I know, anywhere in America has been more clear and forthright about the challenge of the unserved millions than this commission. And here are your own words, which we took to heart in your, I think from your annual report. Commissioner Lovers has given many, many speeches about it, certainly helped sensitize a lot of us early on to this necessity. And it struck me as I was looking ahead to this meeting that our friend, the late Stan Jones, talked about it too. In this quote, I guess he was talking about Indiana, but he took this to the national level and was among the America's most forthright spokespersons for the need to do something that reaches the non-completers and grows in a big way the number of Americans who are ready for this century and this economy. I could wear you out with a lot more of these, but there's been a lot of very favorable comment. I think some of it premature. We have to make this work before some of these laudatory statements will be genuinely deserved. But we appreciate the way it's been received and hope to live up to it. Now, let me talk about Kaplan, which we now refer to as New U, pending some decision about its ultimate label. It was reaccredited last year for 10 years. No interim reports are required under this system, the so-called open pathway, which a lot of big name universities are not placed on. And this happens to be, as you know, the same accrediting body which folks at Purdue and will be on our campus next year. In Indiana, the Board for Proprietary Education, which for the last few years has been under the supervision of this commission, also has authorized this school. If you were to read as I have, the HLC's accreditation report, it is unequivocal and highly positive. I just couldn't resist putting this here. There was a terrific article about a Purdue graduate and her non-complete, her husband, each of whom hopes to pursue a degree at our school. This couple is squarely in the bullseye. These are the two kinds of Hoosiers that we hope to reach and draw in to New U. And each of them would tell you this is the only way that they are likely to get that, either finish that degree or, in her case, get that next nursing degree. And this is because of the very unique characteristics of the marketplace that we seek to serve. 5 out of 6 of current Kaplan students are those non-completers who tried and then something got in the way. And now, because this is what they look like, the majority of them over 30, the average age is 33, 3/4 are females, almost all are working. 55% are first generation college students, and the vast majority have, on the U.S. Department of Education definition, 3 or more of the so-called, of the 6 so-called risk factors. So it's a very, very challenging population for anybody to try to and first enlist and then see through to a successful degree. Something that I think speaks volumes about the people that we are now to be associated with is a unique practice. They label it the Kaplan Commitment. A student can attend Kaplan University for up to 3 weeks at no charge. And I was surprised to find out that 1 out of 4 who enrolled in the most recent measurement period did not continue past the 3 weeks. 12% at their own instance. They tried it and they said, I can't do this. My life's too complicated. My other burdens are too heavy. They go without any cost. 13%, an additional 13%, were dismissed, is the term they used, by Kaplan for failure to participate actively enough in the first 3 weeks of their online coursework. This to me says a lot about their commitment. They want the students who do enroll to succeed at the highest possible rate. Still a challenge given the demographics we're talking about. But they have willingly, unlike any other university I can name, public, nonprofit, or proprietary, willingly foregone the tuition revenue from 1 in 4 students. In fact, after they had done this, the U.S. Department of Education seized on it, I hesitate to say plagiarized it, and started issuing guidance that said this is what other people ought to do. So there in the gray box are the risk factors. I guess I said 6, I guess there are 7, that the U.S. Department uses in assessing how challenging any school's population, as you can see, that the vast majority of Kaplan students have a 3 or more, and the majority have 4 or more. These are folks who will never be able to come to the West Lafayette campus under any circumstances. Hardly a one. And as Tom Kean may have told you, increasingly our regional campuses, if they happen to live close to one, but our regional campuses increasingly are populated by full-time students who are in their 20s on average. A few years older than our West Lafayette population, but not nearly in the category we're looking at here. Despite that, their graduation rates, and we all know the limitations of IPED's data, but it's the only apples to apples we have. And that minority of their students who are first-time and full-time, their record equates or better to the regionals in this state, to say nothing of Ivy Tech or some of their for-profit competitors. They measure a lot of things that, frankly, we should all measure. And at Purdue, we're committed to trying to measure more often in the future. So, for instance, 2 years and 5 years out, they longitudinally track their graduates very rigorously. And these are the income gains, again, for their graduates. They have to succeed, they have to get the degree to be on this chart. But they are rightly proud of the positive effect on life that their degrees have. There are alumni satisfaction surveys. We're proud of ours at Purdue, but ours look about like this. And theirs are just as good. was really grateful that I talked to the immediate past Secretary of Education just before the announcement. I just wanted to test his reaction. His department, after all, was extremely hard, and with justification, on the proprietary sector as a whole. And this is what Arnie Duncan said, and he not only offered, he almost insisted on saying this publicly on the day of the announcement. Now, not everybody says nice things, and so these quotes may seem to be similar, at least to some you've heard. But what you need to know is these quotes come from 1870. This is what was said at the time Purdue University and the land-grant schools were created. When the incumbent institutions of the day thought, no, you can't seriously plan to offer higher degrees in higher education to this wider population. The last one there happens to come from the veto message of President Buchanan the first time they tried to pass the Morrill Act. So, the way we look at it, this is our duty. It's a huge opportunity for the state, as the commission keeps reminding us. We do believe this is the one way that we can reach people who individually deserve a better chance in life, and who Indiana and the nation need to have that chance. I went to, 2 days ago, I spent the day visiting Kaplan facilities in Iowa and in Illinois, had a nationwide town hall by the internet with faculty, and then another one with staff. Incredibly idealistic people. Walking in the lobby in Chicago, there was a woman standing at the information desk, and when she saw Betty, who's here, she was writing a note, and she saw Betty, and ran over, and the hugging started. She had graduated the previous, I guess, Sunday, and had come down to the headquarters just to write a note and thank her for the new life that she was now going to have. If any of you have been to a WGU Indiana graduation, they look much the same. And so we thank the commission for holding our feet to the fire, it really have, for putting this issue on the public agenda, for reminding everybody in public capacities and in the business sector and elsewhere of the need to do better, and the huge opportunity that's there if we can find the ways. And we hope that the new you will be one important vehicle for doing that. Thank you for having me on. Look forward to your questions.
Questions from President Daniels? Al, I saw your hand first.
Well, Mitch, you left a very important slide off.
Well, probably several, but which one do you want to see?
So is it really true the university paid $1 for a guaranteed $10 million a year for at least 6 years? And why are you in the university business and not in the business?
Well, knowing you, Mr. Hubbard, if you had made the transaction, it would have been 75 cents. You drive a hard bargain.
Embarrassed by this deal. What is poor Don Graham?
Well, I do believe, and I think this is very important. I mean, I do believe that as a public university, de-risking and essentially entirely this deal from a financial standpoint, this transaction is important. Very good question has been asked from time to time. Is there any way that the Indiana taxpayer could be exposed to? The answer is no. We're not asking for a single dollar, never expect to. If the university grows back to the size it once was or beyond, and I don't know any reason why it shouldn't, then first of all, our partners, through the contract for services, will over time have a good chance to earn out, you could say, earn back the value they had created in this enterprise. And meanwhile, it could turn into a very significant revenue stream for Purdue. It's not the reason we did it, but there is the real possibility that years from now, it could be an important contributor to Purdue's ability to invest in its offerings, keep tuition down, whatever the leadership of the day thinks is most important.
John?
A comment. First of all, I think it sounds like a very interesting and worthwhile. I've read most of the material. I noticed there are no safe spaces on the, what are students going to do when there's no safe spaces on the internet? No, I'm kidding. But one thing earlier this morning, they talked about the fact that their enrollment had been declining. Is there some reason for that? I mean, this is a growing situation, and I just wondered why their enrollment had been declining.
Yes, great question. Probably the single most important slide that I've shown on other occasions and didn't bring here today shows that there was a sector-wide plummet in enrollment in the proprietary or for-profit schools starting in about 2012. And a concomitant sharp increase in the nonprofit sector, WGU being a good example of that. By now, most Americans have heard of Southern New Hampshire University. Right? Everybody seen ads? It's a little too flip, but I said to one of their people just yesterday, I said, 10 years ago, people in New Hampshire hadn't heard of Southern New Hampshire University. Now, so they've gone from 0 to 85,000 students. Why? Well, there's been a relentless regulatory, I'm going to say, assault on the sector, and a lot of publicity. And a lot of this was deserved, but it was also, fine institutions who were trying to do things the right way, were getting some pretty good results, got tarred with the same brush as some that weren't, I think is the simple way to put it. But if you were to see that chart, John, it would quickly become apparent to you that, and if New U can begin to grow at anything like the rates of Southern New Hampshire and the WGU and so forth, as I said before, it'll be a very, very strong proposition for Purdue and for the contracting agency, the capital.
Chris, I think you.
Mitch, you in your opening remarks talked about educating the next generation to come along isn't fast enough, and we've got to do something about the 750,000 in Indiana, the 36 million across the United States that have some degree. In some ways, there's a more, when you talk about fast, the real issue for the longer term is going to be continuing education, because the world is changing so fast now. Being educated and then out there and not continuing your education, a continuing learning process, you become irrelevant after about 5 years. Is there a platform here, or do you perceive a platform in the future for doing something that's not necessarily, maybe still certificate related, but it's not necessarily related to degrees and time to graduation and all that, but really it is a continual education in a series of disciplines that someone wants to pursue?
Absolutely. I think we all believe that the world has to head that direction. It is now, and this will give us the capability to do it. I can name a couple contexts in which we've been talking about it for some time at Purdue. One is our alums. I think that the contract with an entering student, starting really now at Purdue, ought not be the historic one. Come here, have 4 really great years that prepare you for life, see you at a football game. It ought to be, come have the most important 3 or 4 years, but you just signed up to Purdue for life, and we will have offerings throughout days that allow you to grow and add and so forth. So that's one. Alums is one. Our own staff, by the way, we have agreement. There will be a discount for Indiana students against the tuition of New U, and also for staff at Purdue. The first message I got on the morning of the announcement came from a very excited woman on the staff at West Lafayette who emailed me and said, "Oh boy, now I have a way I can get that Purdue degree that I didn't finish." And so from a professional development standpoint, as you say, it doesn't have to be degrees. Bill Sullivan, who you heard from this morning, has been looking for a way to get a lot of his financial people to let's say an accounting course or to something that will upgrade their skills. And that'll probably be one of the first things we do. But I think that you're absolutely right, and this will only be limited by our imagination and energy.
Dennis.
Thank you. Hello, President.
Hi, Dennis.
During our lunch, we talked about Purdue, for example, I think being number 12 in terms of patents in the world, not the nation. And then there was the presentation about the graduation rates. You mentioned in the lunch there's one of these sectors that one of the issues that you all have to address is the issue of the reputation.
Yeah.
And so we have this tier 1 institution, we have these high or strong graduation rates, and then there's a cap on 29% graduation rate. So talk to us, if you will, about how you're addressing the issue of quality tied to reputation, and whether someone feels like, well, are you diluting my degree? Does it mean the same? How are you all addressing that issue?
It's a great question, maybe the central question. As I think I might have mentioned, there are a lot of big questions. We got most of them resolved pretty quickly and spent a lot of time on this one. Well, this is a great place to ask it. This place has been here for, Purdue Northwest been here for 60 years. It's a Purdue degree that people receive at commencement's here. But it's different, and the world understands it. It was earned at a different place. It's a different population that's been served. And yet we think that there's still a connotation of quality that comes with the Purdue name. And we think it'll be just the same. It's just that we'll be dealing with a third circle or a third stratum, if you want to think of it that way, a very different demographic. But we expect that in each such population, there will be real value of the kind that I showed you, a big improvement in life prospects from that degree. So I don't know what we're going to call the new university yet. I don't know that it'll have Purdue's name in it. It might. But we'll stand behind it just as we have always stood behind the degrees at our regionals, just as IU does with the degrees that they give at Kokomo or Richmond or somewhere not Bloomington.
Okay, Micah, time for one more.
So just to try and clarify something you just said, that one of the very first messages you got was from a staff member of Purdue who said, "Oh, good, now I can get a Purdue degree." Why are Purdue staff members, to use your accounting class example, not being sent to an accounting class that you're already offering on your campus? Why are they only being offered now with capital?
Well, you'd have to ask her. She could have signed up, I suppose, but under our circumstance, she'd have to sign up as a student like anybody else, be admitted, which might or might not happen. New U will be an open university. My guess is that she feels that she can fit this into her life of work, and I'll bet you kids and so forth, in a way that attending class and having to be there at 2 o'clock on a Thursday probably conflicts with work, that sort of thing. On our campus today just wouldn't work. So it's probably about the flexibility as it is for, I think, the vast majority of the current students that they have.
Hey, Dan, can I ask one quick?
You may, Al. Now you're the last.
When this was first announced, there was consternation on the part of some of the faculty. I'd love to hear what their concerns were and what your answers have been.
Those that expressed one, which was in our faculty's or our university senate, I think it was natural enough. There was a lot of surprise, and I think it was a sort of a hasty reaction. That even some of the folks who expressed these concerns, I think, are going to feel different as they learn more. But without waiting to learn much, they did react, and I think they expressed two concerns. One was that in some fashion this was going to be an inferior education. To be honest, the statement's a lot like the ones I showed you from 1870. The other was that they should have been part of the decision process. And there are two things that wrong with that. One is that it's really not their decision. If you read the statutes of Indiana, if you read the bylaws of Purdue, decisions about the structure of the university, including, in fact, what is to be taught, and so forth, are squarely the province of the trustees. And so, on top of that, we had the problem that this was a negotiation with a public company. And there are federal securities laws and state trade secrets laws that we were every day extraordinarily concerned about accidentally violating. So we spread the circle as widely as we thought we could. All the deans were involved in the conversation for weeks and selected other faculty members. We talked at some length about widening the circle a little further, including the leadership of the Senate, and decided, may have been unnecessarily cautious, but decided that we didn't want to take the chance. That we already considered ourselves, I think, somewhat fortunate that the markets were not, that this didn't leak into the markets. So I think that's a reflection of the concerns that we heard. I will tell you that, and maybe Professor Dooley told you earlier today, we've got lots of faculty, not just at the Purdue campus, but in Northwest and at Fort Wayne, who have checked in and are very interested in this and want to start thinking now about how it can become a part of or an extension of their teaching. And so we'll work as closely as we can with any and all faculty who want to be part of it, and we're pretty excited about the possibilities, not just for doing what I talked about here, but for using this platform and these technologies and what our new colleagues know to make Purdue West Lafayette stronger.
Wonderful. Well, on behalf of the entire commission, thank you so much for being here, number one, for your continued tremendous leadership and innovation and commitment to the university itself, to the citizens of Indiana. It's just so much appreciated, so much recognized. And with any big, bold idea, there's going to be a lot of questions, and so we appreciate the willingness of your entire team to help us all kind of work through the issues that you're just now thinking about and ones yet to come. But we really appreciate all the hard work and your being here. So.
Always at your service.
Thanks again, President Dan. How nice. I just had a note delivered that our friends at Purdue University have provided a cake in John Conan's honor in the back. So we all get dessert. Thank you, Purdue. Very nice. Let's see here. Commissioner Lubbers, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's appropriate that you mention the cake because I want to begin my remarks by extending my sincere thanks to Dr. Conan as well on behalf of the staff of CHE. You have in immeasurable ways made our work so much better, and I think this cross-pollination that takes place between strong business and community leaders in the state who serve on the commission and our student who serves on the commission and certainly the faculty member. We are all so much better because of that. So many times you remind us of a perspective that is not our daily perspective. And I'm incredibly grateful also for your acknowledgement of the fact that this group of people, we work really hard. But at the end of the day, I think we have a very strong shared goal of increasing education attainment and higher education, the quality and the service we have to Hoosiers. So thank you so much, John. I appreciate it. I'd also like to thank, I know that President Daniels has left, but I'd like to thank him. You probably know he was in Washington, D.C. this morning, and because he felt so strongly about being here with you today, he moved the National Conference of State Legislators agenda around so he could speak earlier there and be here with us for lunch and for this afternoon, and as well as the key members of the staff who joined us this morning for a lengthy discussion. I think it really helped us as a group to collect our thoughts, think about how we're going to move forward before we take up this issue in August, which is our intention to do so. Since we're at Purdue, I think it's important that I follow up a little bit on what Dom mentioned earlier about the action that you took to set the targets, the non-binding targets for tuition and mandatory fees. And certainly, we know that West Lafayette came in, and this is so much, $10 less than where he was before. And those who know the spirit in which I offer that comment, that was a little frustrated when he saw that tuition was going to be $10,002, and that $2 just stuck in his craw, I'm sure. So he figured out a way to go back and revisit that so that their tuition was actually a little bit less than it would be before. But also, I wanted to acknowledge that the two other campuses, IPFW and Purdue Northwest, have established a banded tuition. You will recall that this has been a part of our action when we talked about tuition and fees, that we also wanted to move toward banded tuition. So I'm delighted to know that that is actually taking place on this campus as well. And by moving to banded tuition, it's going to be easier for students to complete on time, and it really help us with our goals on 15 to finish and others. We talked a little bit at our student success meeting about the impact of 15 to finish on students in Indiana. It was recognized recently, for those of you who read or see the articles that we send to you from Inside Higher Education. There was an independent study by Post-Secondary Analytics of our 15 to finish campaign and our financial aid reform more generally, really citing that the financial aid changes and the campaign have shown significant increases in on-time completion in Indiana. You're going to see that as we talk a little bit later, and Stacy presents our completion report. But many people were fearful that as the commission continued to advocate for more timely completion, we would be driving students out of the system, or that it was not a reasonable expectation. They found certainly no negative impact at all on the financial aid reform that we had, requiring students to take more credits while they were there. Lumina puts out an annual report called A Stronger Nation. It was recently published. As you know, our 60% goal that we've established for Attainment Indiana has really been informed by Lumina's work that they have done, and really the data analysis of what the workforce needs would be. As you know, that 60% goal is tied to what we think the workforce would need. And as this audience certainly knows this, but we remind other audiences, sometimes people get confused between attainment and the completion reports and graduation. We're talking about essentially the adult population between the ages of 25 and 64 who have a quality degree or credential. We keep making progress, although I'm impatient, as I know many of you are as well, for us to move in a faster way. But the most recent Stronger Nation saw that as a state, we ticked up a little bit from 41.1% of that 60% goal, to 41.1% from 40.9%. So we keep moving in the right direction. We just have to keep keeping our foot on the pedal so we get there a little more quickly. That does, just to put it in context, we still remain below the national average, that federal national average, which is 45.8%. With our younger population, we are making a little bit more improvement, and we're very hopeful that our You Can Go Back campaign that's been referenced several times today, with the 750,000 Hoosiers who have some college but no degree, and the recently enacted Workforce Ready grant will help us with those numbers. The Workforce Ready grant in particular, with getting more Hoosiers to have a quality credential. throughout the summer months. We won't be with you in July, but please know that we will be working to meet all of our new statutory requirements, including, we'll be moving in just a moment to talk about our performance funding study. We're also doing a study on Ball State University's Indiana Academy for Science, Math, and Humanities. We're looking at the whole concept of reverse transfer. We'll be working with the Governor's Office and the Department of Education and DWD on a workforce alignment and several other new procedures aligned to the distribution of financial aid. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will turn it back over to you.
Very good, thank you. Any questions for Teresa and her report? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to the minutes from the May 11th Commission meeting. I would entertain a motion for approval of the minutes. Second, if I may.
Second.
Any comments, corrections, clarifications from those? Okay, hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Okay, thank you very much. All right, we'll move to our public square session here. And as we continue to work on implementation of our strategic plan, reaching higher and delivering value, we're now moving here today into starting a discussion around performance funding as we study this issue as we agreed to. Number one, we had planned to do this, and then we're actually formally challenged and charged by the General Assembly to engage in a review of our performance funding formula after a number of years, so thus we are doing so. So today we're going to hear from Commission staff, we're going to hear from Commissioner Lovers and Dominic Chase, and as well as Martha Snyder from HCM Strategies. Martha's worked specifically in a number of states, including Indiana, West Virginia, and others, with state leaders and policymakers to facilitate development of performance-based funding recommendations and strategies around that. And we're pleased to have her here today to share the latest trends and issues in that arena and help us as we again begin this conversation, renew this conversation. So I want to turn it over to Commissioner Lovers to lead this session.
Thank you. And I'm just going to make a few brief introductory comments. We're delighted to have Martha here with us. She and HCM Strategies have helped the Commission many times in the past, and so she understands the landscape of Indiana very well. And so thank you, Martha. I want to say personal thanks to you. And looking at performance funding, I want to begin by just extending my thanks to the members of the Commission, especially those who have served for a long time on the Commission, because you have shown a sustained commitment to this concept of paying for what we value, both in terms of how we distribute money to the institutions and how we distribute money to students based on how we distribute financial aid. And Indiana is really a leader, as I think Martha will attest to when she makes her comments, and she does a little bit of information about a national perspective on performance funding. But I've been in this position for 8 years now. When we came, I had the good fortune to inherit from Stan Jones a commitment to performance funding. And but during this time, we have continued to evolve the system to one that is more aligned to paying for what we value. So at one point, we transitioned our metrics to complete student success metrics, that they were really aligned about how could we increase student success. This is against the backdrop of this 60% goal as well, so we try to align everything that we do around the idea of paying for what we value. It's been a challenge because what you want to do is provide consistency in your metrics. You don't want to change them all the time, because if you do, you can't measure, you can't move forward, you can't give the institutions the time to actually adapt to those changing metrics. By the same token, over the course of the nearly 15 years, and it's true that for the first couple budget sessions, we had only a research metric, and then we evolved into the student success metrics. But we have also tried to listen to our partner colleges and universities and say, what can we do better? What period of time do we use to measure these? What are the right metrics to do this? And so we're constantly in a situation of balancing those two. I have always wanted, at the end of the day, whether I was going to speak to a college president or I was speaking to the chairman of the appropriations committee, that I could feel very, very strongly that I could defend the metrics we had, that we were in fact measuring the right things. I feel very strongly that we are. 90% of those metrics that 90% of the money that we distribute go to those big three metrics, getting more students to complete, hard to argue with that, getting more to complete on time whenever possible or to shorten the length of time, and to get more of our at-risk students that President Daniels mentioned, for example, students who qualify for Pell. And then, of course, we've carved out other metrics based on the missions of our institutions. So much like, we tried to do in our guiding principles, our strategic plan, which were to develop a student-centered, mission-driven, workforce-aligned system of higher education. We tried to do that. I would offer that the area that's been the most difficult for us to do that, and one which we want to continue to have the discussion about, is how do those metrics actually do the workforce alignment part? Or how do they measure a quality metric? There are some areas that we still are struggling to figure out how to do that. As the chairman indicated, before the legislative session, when we were putting together our budget recommendations, we made a commitment to the colleges and universities that we believe in regularly looking at our metrics to see if they are giving every institution the opportunity to earn back money, to be rewarded for their efforts. And so we were committed to going back and looking at our metrics again, against the backdrop that we really would have to be convinced that there was a really strong reason to make any substantive change to those metrics. It's one thing to tweak the metrics within the ones that we have in a certain way. It's another to introduce new metrics or take away metrics. So we really wanted to be very careful about how we did that. Our partners in the legislature thought that was a great idea, and so included in the budget language that said we want you to look at performance funding and to see if it's aligning with Indiana's higher education goals. So I'll be meeting with all the college presidents this summer, as we have done with our strategic plans in the past, as we've done with performance funding, to sit down and have a chance to listen to them, find out what they feel. I think without being too strident when I say this, I think there is a strong commitment on the part of policymakers in this commission to hold to performance funding. And I think the college presidents know that as well. But I want to know, as your spokesperson to them, are there things that we're not thinking about? Are there things that we can do better? And exactly what does that look like? We'll have a discussion about their strategic plans and how our strategic plan aligns with theirs. So we're committed to meeting with presidents. We'll be meeting with legislators and policymakers to say, what do you think about performance funding? You've been supportive. Thank you. You've been very supportive of performance funding. Is there anything we should know? But to me, the most significant group to talk to, in addition to the college presidents, are sitting around this table today. And you're the ones who had the vision to actually lead in this. And as we start this work, I want to make sure that we're engaging in you every step of the process as well. So today will be an opportunity for us to look at this issue for the next 45 minutes or 50 minutes, get a perspective from Martha at the national level, what's happening in performance funding, is there anything that we can learn, what do we need to think about, and then we will be, as a staff, going about having these meetings and beginning to do this work with the expectation that certainly by the end of the year, and sooner rather than later, that we would be bringing to you our recommendations for performance funding. We want to do that as soon as we can to give the institutions as much information as possible to move forward. Just as a reminder, you will recall that during this last legislative session, we ended up at 6.5% for performance funding in the second year, at 5.25% in the first year. And one of the things that's always a discussion is, depending on how much new money you have, what is your tolerance for reallocating the base? And that's a part of the discussions as well. I think some of the other areas that we will be talking about would be, how does this whole focus on certificates, how is it acknowledged in performance funding? What's the impact on adults? Is that a at-risk population? What about quality and labor outcomes? Those are just a few of the buckets that we might be talking about as well. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would like us to turn over first to Martha and ask her to share with us some of her thoughts, some of her perspectives on Indiana's formula and how we fit in around the nation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Commissioner Lubbers, for the welcome and for having me in Indiana. It's nice to be back. I do want to first give kudos to Indiana in terms of the leadership, and particularly of the commission, and the commissioner, the leadership on a national level, not just on performance funding, but as was referenced earlier, certainly on the financial aid reforms that you've made, those are getting national attention as well. So always a pleasure to be in Indiana, and certainly to provide some insights as to our view of the context of, particularly on this topic, performance-based funding. I think much of what I'm going to walk through will actually echo the introduction that the commissioner gave in terms of, again, Indiana is kind of a national leader on this topic as well as on others. But certainly as a leader in performance funding, certainly for your commitment and your sustainability of the reforms you've made over time, but your commitment and sustainability over many years to the concept. The importance in that regard of sustaining the effort and kind of balancing that consistency with flexibility and responsiveness to institutional requests or institutional insights and concerns, as well as kind of the evolving nature of state priorities in terms of, as was mentioned already, workforce and certain student populations. So with that as background, I'm just going to kind of walk through, first of all, with HCM Strategists, I'm going to kind of tell you who we are at HCM Strategists and kind of the work we do in states as it relates to performance-based funding and the avenue through which we're supported to do that, which is the Lumina Foundation component of this. Then we'll walk through some of the rationale for outcomes-based or performance-based funding, why policymakers see this as an important concept, particularly in the completion and attainment agenda at the national level. Give you some context in terms of where Indiana sits in the national context of best practices, and then just talk through kind of what the research says, including some research that's come out on 3 states, one of which includes Indiana. So HCM Strategist is a public policy firm, an advocacy firm, headquartered in Washington, D.C., though the post-secondary policy staff is kind of spread throughout the country. I actually live and come from Albany, New York. And so we have a team of about 15 post-secondary policy experts that support our work in the field, again, spread throughout the country. Much of the work that we do in the state post-secondary policy space is actually supported by Lumina Foundation through their Strategy Labs efforts. The Strategy Labs is really the mechanism by which Lumina supports states in the development of policies that are built around the attainment agenda and in line with the Lumina Foundation state policy agenda. Through the Strategy Labs, HCM is kind of the manager and the arbitrator of technical assistance, research, and other advising support, as well as providing opportunities to hear from and engage with peers across states, learn about best practices. You know, Commissioner Lovers and her staff have actually been called upon in many ways to be those experts in other states and those witnesses and those provide that information and insight around the efforts that you have in place. As I mentioned, the Lumina State Policy Agenda, which is really the backdrop for the Strategy Labs efforts, is all centered on, as you all know, being in Indiana, the goal 60%, the big goal that Lumina has of 60% by 2025. Very well aligned with Indiana's own goal. But the state policy agenda is focused on student-centered and outcomes-based educational systems, as well as increasing the capacity to reach more students, innovation, alternative pathways, etc. Within the state policy agenda, and the new state policy agenda was actually just recently put out by the Lumina Foundation, there's kind of 4 core elements. State commitment, which is just the articulation of a goal, the flag post or the kind of the goal post for where a state needs to get in terms to meet its workforce needs. Again, in the case of Indiana, 60%. A strategic finance component, which has 2 elements to it. One of which we're here to talk about today, the performance-based or outcomes-based funding component. The other is a broader look at the finances and the resources that are flowing into the system, and analysis of how those are supporting more broadly the outcomes that are needed in terms of serving certain students and producing certain credentials. The affordability piece, which is primarily centered on need-based aid as well as some other aspects, but the core component of that is need-based aid and making sure that your need-based aid policies support full-time enrollment and progression, as well as provide opportunities for non-traditional students beyond just low-income 18-year-olds, but low-income adults to pursue and receive credentials. And then again, the innovation component, the alternative pathways, redesigned models, and alternative avenues for students to enter into the system. I would say some of what President Daniels discussed probably falls certainly in the innovation bucket. So just going to walk through. Much of this is, I'm sure, the kind of 101 for you, and you've probably heard it before as you were discussing performance funding previously. But always good to kind of put this in context in terms of why do states pursue performance-based funding, why are states interested in this from a conceptual level in terms of, and where does it fit within the broader strategic approach that states are taking. The policy rationale for outcomes-based funding or performance-based funding is really as simple as as I think Indiana says it so succinctly, paying for what you value, or aligning the state's funding method with state goals and priorities, particularly in terms of attainment and equity, particular student populations, supporting jobs and economic development or workforce outcomes. And then certainly there's an accountability and transparency mechanism or element to that. If a state or the legislature and particular policymakers know that you are funding institutions on these certain outcomes, that's an element of accountability and transparency. With the idea that that actually filters down to the institutions to align with institutional priorities and efforts to scale certain best student success best practices and foster a kind of environment of programmatic evaluation and change. Just in terms of where performance funding kind of sits within the other elements of state funding models, for the most part, most states have a kind of combination of these different approaches to funding their institutions. There's very few states that kind of go all base or all historic or all enrollment or even all outcomes based. And again, most states have a combination, but there's generally kind of 3 to 4 types of funding components that states use. Historic or base plus, a large majority of states have a historic or base plus, which is kind of goes plus or minus depending on what the legislature is able to support or allocate to post-secondary education. An enrollment component, which is just based on the numbers of students coming in at some, or in classes at some particular census date. And then we do distinguish a little bit between early performance funding models. The concept of performance funding has been around for a very long time, but those earlier performance funding models, which were, I'll get into a little bit, but were kind of, the conceptualization of them was based on rewarding certain priorities, but not necessarily squarely focused on student outcomes and student success, to what we see more today, a movement towards performance funding 2.0 or outcomes-based funding, which is squarely focused on student success and completion needs. And this kind of walks through how we clarify those 2 different focuses, or those 2 different distinguishing characteristics between early performance funding and performance funding 2.0 or outcomes-based funding. I would say Indiana's efforts certainly probably started off as more the early performance funding with kind of a focus on research, and a way to expand the research mission of certain institutions, and has certainly evolved into the performance funding 2.0 or outcomes-based funding with a very explicit focus on student outcomes, progression, and certainly closing gaps among certain student groups. This shows you kind of the national context in terms of state interest and activity around performance-based funding. Much of the map is colored. And we hear constantly from states that are interested in at least understanding the concept of performance-based funding. The states in green are those that were implementing in fiscal year 17. The states in the lighter blue are those that have something that is developed, but they have not yet implemented as of fiscal year 17. And then those darker teal states are 2 states that have task forces. Actually, in the last week, we've heard from Alabama about an official task force that's being put in place to review this. Despite the activity across the nation, there still remains wide variation across these outcomes-based funding or performance-based funding models. And this is where I kind of want to center the conversation on, is these elements of strong policy, and where I see Indiana sitting within the context of elements of strong policy. The variation in states really centers around where they sit in terms of approaching and considering these elements. We think strong outcomes-based or performance-based funding policies, again, this is based on research that was done on earlier funding models as well on more recently on existing funding models, but that they are linked to or at least very strongly derived from an attainment or completion goal. That is the anchor, that is the central focus, and again, the student success and completion priorities that fall under that attainment or completion goal, getting more students to complete, particularly getting at-risk students not just in the doors, but to completion, supporting progression through to completion, and again, a focus certainly on on-time completion. That the funding formula and the sources of funds for that is stable and formula-driven, that it's not based on institutions meeting certain targets, but it's based on growth over time. And it's driven through a funding formula, and that, again, the sources of those fundings are stable, so that there is a component of existing or reallocation, or at least a consistent source of funding and sustainability over time. That the level of funding is sufficient to drive institutional change. We don't have a clear directive on what is sufficient, but actually what Indiana has showed us, and I'll get into some of this research a little bit later, is that even though you are, relative to some other states, have a lower percentage that's allocated to your performance funding model, the sustainability of that over time, as well as some of the volatility that's built within the distribution, actually does result in institutional change, and so there's not necessarily a magic cutoff in terms of significant level of funding, but it's more the sustainability and the kind of cumulative effect of that over time that has an impact. That all public institutions are included. We do have there are some states out there that only do it in one sector. They only focus on the community colleges or only focus on a subset of four-year institutions. Again, since this is a representation of how the state invests its dollars and pays for what it values, we believe that it should include all public institutions. That being said, there should be some element of differentiation in terms of the metrics or how the metrics apply to different institutions to reinforce and support the mission of different institutions and the students they serve. That degree completion is an anchor and a very clear element of the funding model. And that at-risk students are represented in some clear way. And again, that the model is sustained over consecutive years. So if I had flipped this list into a checklist for Indiana, for the most part, I think you would get green checks on all of them, with, again, as Commissioner Lubbers indicated, certainly some areas that can be further discussed as you have implemented this funding model for a couple of years. There's probably some areas that you could reconsider in terms of the students that are represented in the funding model, potentially expanding the categories that you're discussing, how you're measuring degrees or credential completion, and potentially some discussion around other areas to further differentiate across mission. And we can get into all of that conversation a little bit later. In terms of, just to give you an example of the common measures, this again kind of will help you, I think, put, particularly as Dom goes, we'll put Indiana's model in context of kind of national common measures. Tend to kind of fall across four different, or really three different categories, and then the fourth there is really a priority for certain students or degrees. But the three categories of metrics would be student progression and momentum, credit accumulation, progression through remedial education success, completion of first-year college-level courses in English and math, and then completion and outcomes, certainly numbers of transfers, program completers or degree completers, graduation rates, and some states that use job placement, and then some reflection of productivity and institution mission. Common ones are research and workforce training, or workforce outcomes. And then again, that priority student category, this is the at-risk students that we're talking about right now in Indiana. As Commissioner said, you include or identify at-risk students as Pell-eligible students. Some other states have included adult students. They've done a measure of academically underprepared students. There are a handful of states that have identified underrepresented minority students as at-risk and as a priority weighting within the funding model. And then there are also a priority for certain types of degrees, STEM age being the most common. Some other considerations as states have implemented these funding models for a couple of years, some of the other considerations that we hear consistently are certainly around quality. I get that question probably most frequently is how do you address quality in a funding model? My recommendation would be quality is a very difficult thing to measure consistently across institutions. There is no direct measure of quality that, again, is consistently measured across all institutions. There are some potentially postgraduate outcomes that you could look at, but what states have done for the most part on the quality issue is kind of a monitoring. They've set up monitors or certain measures that they will monitor alongside the implementation of the funding model. Things like licensure assessments or general education assessments, grade inflation over time, major field assessments, academic program reviews. But building them within an actual funding model, again, can be difficult because there's not necessarily consistent data across all institutions, and the measures are pretty inconsistent as well. Other very common kind of conversation right now, as the conversation kind of shifts from just completion to actually workforce alignment and getting students into jobs, is how can you start to incorporate postgraduate outcomes into these funding models? This definitely remains an evolving field. Again, something that is for the most part reliant on data that is not necessarily consistent or easily captured across the state or across institutions. We see this primarily reflected as STEM H or other priority field degrees and students completing in certain high priority degrees. Though we have started to see some states evolve to other approaches such as the percent of students employed X number of years out, 1 year and 5 years out, wage increases 1 year and 5 years out, or those students that might be enrolled in advanced degree programs after graduation. So some measure of where are students going after they're actually earning their first credential or earning a credential. Then the other kind of common conversation gets back to that mission differentiation and how you approach mission differentiation. Again, in Indiana, as Dom will get into, the way mission is reflected in the funding model is that there are certain measures that apply to Ivy Tech or to the comprehensive institutions or to Purdue and IU, that there are certain measures that only apply to those different institutions. That is certainly one way that states have done it. There are states that have separated out the funding formula. That has its benefits and minuses as well. Certainly not recommending that for Indiana, but that's one way that states have approached it. They've pulled out the funding for different types of institutions. The way that Indiana has done it is that middle category, and then there's also a different weighting factor, which somewhat I think Indiana does in the way that you kind of put values on different measures in terms of dollars, but weighting across a set of common metrics. This shows you kind of a checklist of what we consider kind of the 3 leading states, Indiana, Tennessee, and Ohio. We consider them leading states because these 3 states have been kind of at it for the longest in terms of development, implementation, review, refinement, etc. This just is a quick checklist in terms of the different metrics that that these 3 states are incorporating, how they apply to different types of institutions, 2-year and 4-year. And then at the bottom there is kind of the percent of funding based on outcomes. Again, I want to emphasize that even though particularly in Tennessee, 85% of their funding model is distributed through the funding model, in many ways the weighting factors that they use in that funding model, there's very little volatility and redistribution. So it's an 85% of the funding that is allocated is run through the funding model. But they have it pretty tightly bound in terms of the effects of that on institutional funding. And then again, Indiana at 6.5% with some volatility depending on the legislature.
What's the 2-year and the 4-year?
So those are the 2-year and 4-year, those are whether or not the measures apply to that particular sector.
Oh, 2-year degree.
2-year, yeah. So for 2-year it would be Ivy Tech. For the 4-year, it would be and then similar in Ohio and Tennessee.
And Marty, I don't know if this is the right time to mention it, but just so people will have a sense of that 6.5%, because we have done performance funding for so long in Indiana, we have about 25% of the base budgets for our institutions have been reallocated now based on performance funding. So that's a point in time in a particular year, but it doesn't reflect what the overall impact on the base budget for our institutions would be.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important part. I would emphasize the sustainability and the cumulative effect, as well as, you know, there is some, within that 6.5%, there's a little bit more volatility in terms of reallocation than what you might see in Tennessee's funding model, even though when you look at that baseline percentage, you would think Tennessee and Ohio are more robustly supported through outcomes. So I just want to spend a minute talking about the research, and then I think we'll probably turn it over to Dom, and then I guess have questions at that point. And this is more for just kind of background context in terms of, you know, does performance-based funding or outcomes-based funding work, particularly in terms of actually achieving student outcomes. And a lot of the research that exists right now is really focused on those earlier concepts of performance-based funding. Those states that were supporting everything from, you know, just they were looking at measures of, such as primarily focused on research, certain measures of, you know, FTE, numbers of FTE in certain programs, not necessarily squarely focused on student outcomes. That being said, the qualitative research behind that, a lot of it done by the Community College Research Center at Columbia, has shown consistently, including some research done in Indiana, that institutions absolutely respond to the financial incentives that are put before them. And in terms of performance-based funding, institutions respond in terms of aligning their programs and their practices to the outcomes that are reflected in that funding model. The quantitative research in terms of does this actually produce more student outcomes and more student graduates is an evolving area. A lot of this early research has actually been the foundational research that informs our work in states in terms of these are the elements that you should consider as you approach performance-based funding. But more recently, there's some research that has come out or is about to come out from an entity called Research for Action that looks at, again, Indiana, Ohio, and Tennessee, because you've been doing this more advanced performance-based funding for longer periods of time, that starts to tease out some of those quantitative effects. And what they have found is that funding models can certainly have effect on student outcomes. The student level data reviewed in those three states, particularly in Indiana and Tennessee, have shown strong and positive effects on outcomes for students. That the sustainability of the policy over time is a very essential factor, that is one of the things that as the model is implemented for longer periods of time, the effects of that model are stronger. And that relatively small percentages of funding can still have effects because of the sustainability over time, because of that cumulative effect. That it's important to balance stability and flexibility. So this goes back to the, you know, institutions and colleges and universities are rightfully constantly asking for change and evaluation. At the same time, there's an important element of stability that you need to have to make sure that institutions have a time to respond to the expectations that are set in a funding model. And states that have done year-to-year changes, Ohio went through a phase of time where they were changing the model every year. And the research showed that those institutions actually didn't like that because they didn't have time to respond effectively. And really the most important thing is that you engage institutions in the process. Help them understand the funding model, ask them, you know, have some kind of walk-around sense that these are the appropriate metrics. These make sense in terms of what institutions do and the outcomes that institutions should be producing. In terms of institutional response, the research also showed that, you know, not surprisingly, the ability of institutions to respond is highly correlated with leadership. And those institutions that had strong leaders had a much greater capacity to respond. But that regardless, institutions did respond. The research shows that in these 3 states those institutions actually had made movements after the implementation of outcomes-based funding or performance-based funding to align strategic plans and really strengthen their student-focused policies. So that is it for my intro remarks in terms of national context and research, and we'll kind of dig through Indiana and then I think ask and answer questions.
Some much more complex than others. I guess I've always felt that our performance funding is effective because we try to really keep it fairly simple, straightforward, and tied clearly to our key goals. So, would you agree that our scheme falls within that, and should we be considering something different?
So I would absolutely agree that your model is relatively straightforward and simple, both in terms of the metrics and the application of the actual formula itself. I think part of the downfall of even more current funding models is that they are very complicated. And they both in terms of how they measure metrics, so they rely on goals, certain targets for institutions that just adds a level of complexity into it, as well as kind of the funding, or the number of metrics. They're weighted down with everything in the kitchen sink because they try to be all things to all institutions. So yes, I think relatively one of the things that makes Indiana so effective is the simplicity of the funding formula. Again, certainly open for some evaluation of how the metrics might be measured or applied. But to your second question, I would not recommend throwing out the model as it currently exists. I would more recommend looking at certain elements of it and seeing how they might align to where the state needs to go. So I think some of the things that have been mentioned already in terms of, should adults be more directly reflected in the funding model? Is there a way to get at some of those postgraduate outcomes that do you have the data to do that and measure that and reward institutions for that? Beyond that, I would say the heart of the funding model is pretty well structured.
And one of our goals, of course, is we talked about today, is to reach those students that have some college education and to bring them back and to complete their degrees. And of course, unless we do that, we'll never reach our goal. Does our funding formula address that particular objective very well? And because it seems to be something we're talking about.
Degrees.
Degrees, yeah.
Give them the benefit. Nobody comes in and finishes a degree.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of simplicity. If you go back historically where we played with these for a period of time. And we thought, and of course, as new members would come to the commission, have an idea, we got to address this cost issue. We've got to address this, we'll deal with the incentive. And we found out that people didn't pay attention to the incentive because it wasn't really very much and we weren't consistent. And we started changing them. And every academic had a different idea about a way to be done. We finally said we're going to be simple, we're going to be consistent, we're going to stay out. And it's going to be about what we're the outcomes. We're looking at the outcomes. What do we really want to get in the end? And the data that we get says we've done pretty well. And I'm always worried about what's up. We could tweak this, and this whole idea of now we're going to look at the outcomes by virtue of what people are paid. I really want people to be paid well, but I've had kids who were paid nothing when they first started. They were very wealthy today. Just the career choices they made. There's some who've gone off to the public sector who aren't making a whole lot. I think we've got to be very careful. We end up losing the effect that we've achieved. I think there's always a tendency to want to tweak and play and add things. And that's it's hard to hold discipline.
And if I can,
John,
I just want to reply in terms of I completely echo that. I am not advocating that you look particularly at the the income and the wage data is incredibly difficult to measure, and there's all kinds of complexities under that. It's there are states that have that have incorporated some of those postgraduate outcomes, not necessarily looking at wage, but if it is something that the state wants to go to in terms of getting even more directly at mission differentiation, potentially particularly for Ivy Tech, we're looking at expanding the list of credentials of value or high priority credentials. Those are other ways to get at some of those elements. I am not here to advocate for even tweaking. That's your decision. It's if there are certain things that you want to reflect, I would recommend you do that in a tweaking fashion, not in a wholesale change of the funding model.
John?
These are almost necessarily and certainly much more easily measured outcome measures, but they don't take into account input measures. And so I'm afraid what we create is a situation in which those universities that have lower entry standards, that are more access to have to go much farther to get to the same place as those universities that have higher entrance standards. And so I wonder if there's some way, without tweaking the measures, to tweak the way that we measure them so that we can be more of a value-added measure than a ending value measure.
Let me comment first. You know, that is one of the things I think has been so important, and in some ways, what our formula does better than some states, in that ours is a growth model. So if you start from a really low base with completion, for example, because you have a really challenged student body, you have the opportunity to earn a lot more money sometimes because you're going to be measured by the growth of that delta that we do. So the combination between actually measuring that base, the growth of that particular institution speaks to that, plus the fact that we have looked at this at-risk measure as well. So and we've also looked at successful remediation as another metric. So I do think, John, that we have to constantly be aware of, you know, how are we giving every institution, based on the kind of students they are accepting and their mission, the opportunity to benefit from the formula. I do believe that our formula is designed in such a way that it does that. Whether we could do that better or whether we consider all those things, I don't know. But it isn't, we don't compare one campus to another in an absolute way. We look at that campus based on its improvement.
Yeah, I would, you know, echo that, reinforce that. I think the way it's reflective both in terms of the fact that you don't rely just on rates, that alone, you know, the fact that you rely on counts, and so there is an incentive to make sure that you that institutions are getting as many students through to completion as possible, and you're not kind of just promoting restricting access. You do have the at-risk weight to it in terms of the Pell eligible, and then yes, the focus on growth over time is an important part of the Indiana funding model, and why I think it does overall support institutional growth and institutions serving particularly underserved student populations. Absolutely ways to further adjust that potentially, and it's certainly something for the state to make sure that it's, you know, keeping an eye on.
At the certain risk of boring my colleagues around the table and those in the audience who heard my comments this morning about quality, I have to say that it's unconscionable to me that there isn't an aggressive way of approaching this issue of quality in higher education with some mechanism over time that begins to standardize the way that we measure quality and do it in a way that gives us some sense of with all the improvements we're making in terms of time to completion and all of those kinds of things, that we're not losing quality along the way in such a multidisciplinary approach to higher education. And I think until that's done, I think we're high risk.
I kind of agree with Chris. I feel like there should be at least looking at trying to figure out a way to measure the quality that our students are getting. Because when you're just watching someone through, you're losing.
I think the thing to remember is we have never done this. And so I think, not that that is any sort of I think it speaks to how difficult it is. I mean, whether you had performance funding or whether you funded schools based on enrollment, it was never based on quality. Now, we've assumed that there were other measures for quality. We've used accreditation, we've used actually the faculty curriculum, the instructor, the grades, those kinds of things have been used. I don't think it should keep us from, I mean, I think we need to have that discussion, but I think we have to acknowledge how hard that discussion is, which shouldn't keep us from having it. But unless there's someone in this room, a lot of smart people in this room, and I'm looking, I don't know one who could offer to us today. You could, for example, require every institution to do CLA, inning and in, and measure that. Not all institutions do that. That doesn't measure still the quality of the student coming in who started with CLA based on their that are going out. So it's just there are all kinds of challenges. And of course, for us, it's even we're challenged by the fact that we are not a board of regents. We're a coordinating board, so we don't run the colleges and universities. Our trick is to try to figure out how do we measure that. That's what I hear you say. You know, how do we really know? I mean, I think, Chris, I'm always informed by the discussion you I had for many, many years when we thought about K-12 reform together and really pushed K-12 reform. When we started having employers hold up a high school diploma and say to us, this diploma doesn't mean anything because they're coming to us and it doesn't mean anything. And so I think that probably informs our feelings about, you know, you don't want that to happen in higher ed. And it would be far better to have a higher ed lead this than to have it be led from the outside.
It wasn't, and you may know more about this, going back a few years, I recall there was an attempt in Virginia, I think, where Virginia had some performance funding, and they required every 5 or 6 or 7 years a review of the programs. And if they met a certain quality level by an outside review, they continued to get funding. If they didn't, they lost funding. It's very vague in my mind.
Yeah, I do believe it was Virginia. There are approaches like that. There's a level of complication there, and you know what the programmatic review entailed, I'm not entirely sure of. I would go back to, in terms of the quality mechanism. I think it's essential. There's two things. One, I think there are certainly indicators you can measure right now to at least be a check on quality over time. Some of that is, survey-based, which is why you wouldn't want to include it in a funding model. Some of it is just direct engagement with employers. Again, that might be kind of survey-based, but certainly students and employer surveys. And then some of these indicators of licensure exam passage rates. And you can monitor that over time, not even just directly related to the funding model and the effects of the funding model, but just more broadly. And then just kind of to the notion that performance-based funding or any incentive kind of creates a incentive for institutions to push students through. I actually, when in talking with with certain student success campuses or student success individuals on campuses, I actually think it's almost the reverse of that, in that whether it's a performance funding model or these other initiatives that are taking place, the student success kind of agenda is actually focusing a lot of this kind of programmatic review and evaluation and reform to better serve students with higher quality. It's focusing, it's resulting in systematic change at the institution that is supporting students and giving them the services and the wraparound supports that they need to actually be successful. I would argue that that is an increased quality of product that is being delivered to the student. The delivering of value in learning is another question that goes back more to the measurement that we don't have a consistent thing for. But I don't like the notion that the student success and the reform that we're seeing result on campuses and getting more students through completion means that quality is diminishing. I think it actually means that we're learning how to serve students better, particularly at-risk students better. That because they weren't completing prior to this doesn't mean that the product was high quality. It just means we weren't serving those students well.
Martha, what happened to the voluntary system of accountability? It was a big thing for a while.
I think that still exists, but I don't know. It never really took the foothold that I think folks were hoping it would.
I see President Bradley here. I know they were very involved in University of Southern Indiana was very involved as well. But so you have some, but you don't have enough to actually compare. The other thing to keep in mind isn't so much about the performance funding form. Keep in mind in Indiana, we've also done our return on investment reports and our Indiana College Value Index, which complement what we're doing here in terms of showing how students are doing. And it really is meant to inform, it is meant to be a consumer tool to inform consumers and students to make better choices. So that sits alongside our performance formula.
What about grade inflation? In other words, I noticed one of the charts up there talking about measuring grade inflation over a period of time. If that's happening, that means the course probably isn't as rigorous.
So that, yes, I mean, or if there's something going on. Grade inflation has been happening for years. There's been a lot of particularly recent attention given, well, recent in the last few years, given to kind of the notion of grade inflation over time. But yeah, I think if you see spikes in, grade inflation and, students getting through certain courses that weren't necessarily a result of reform of those courses, that's an indication that students are being pushed through and monitoring those things alongside a funding formula.
One more from Al here, then we'll move to Don for your comments, please.
Yeah, I guess I think Chris is, I'm glad you made the point, and Reese, I love this interview, and I want to disagree. I
But
think
then
we
you need to tell me how to do it.
Well, I want to encourage you to, the easy thing, create some task force, create, ask one of your brilliant staffers, or more than one of your brilliant staffers, to come up with a menu for us of some options, like this, we exchanged emails on the CLA, plus part of it in the Wall Street Journal this week. We ought to measure value add at the university level. Just like we try to do it at the K-12, and we ought not just say it's too complicated and too hard. And I think we at least ought to exhaustively look at what the options are.
We will, we have, and we need to continue.
But I think, let's don't just push it off. I think we ought to say, okay, by some meeting in September, August, October, you pick the...
Can I put you the head of the task force? Work with me?
Sure.
Okay, then, okay.
We did it for about 8 weeks.
So moved.
Okay.
You have got to
And
be on
anybody
it.
from colleges and universities out there in the audience, I welcome your participation to inform the work that we're doing so that we are operating from a base of knowledge.
I would just suggest that you went back 15 years. And when the first discussions came out about the idea of getting students to graduate on time, there were all the reasons why it couldn't be done. And yet we started slowly, and Martha, to your presentation, there's been an evolution of improvement over time, but you start somewhere. And then it begins to improve, more people buy into it, we begin to find some standardization, and then, because if we don't get at this, right now, the United States has lost its global leadership in higher education. It's just a fact. And if we don't get that back, the implications long-term for this country globally are massive. And so it is something that we've got to look at. Okay.
We will do that. We did this a couple years ago. We brought in all the measures that can be used across the country. And we ended up at that point, you will recall, saying one of those steps that we could take is to start doing what Martha showed, which is passage rates on professional licensure exams. And that's a small step that we could get. You're only going to get a small percent of the population that you're going to have that with. Of the article that you talked about, in the nation, there were 200 campuses, as I recall, who did CLA. And so...
Well, but again, I don't know what the details are, but you could require the public institutions to do CLA.
What is CLA?
It's the California Learning Assessment. Is that what it's? The collegiate learning assessment. And so it's an exam that...
I'm not saying it's
We had a Weldon conference that was focused on this.
We did. That's just what our Weldon conference was this year. So, and lest you think that we don't think it's important, let me assure you that we do. And that, I think...
But it's just too hard.
I didn't say that. I said we don't, we...
Haven't found a solution yet, Al.
No, but
It was too hard until you stepped in as chair of this.
But I did make him, with your permission, Mr. Chairman, I did make him the chair of the committee that's going to help us do it.
Yeah.
Well, I was co-chair with Mr.
I'll be happy to...
If this team can't get it done, then it just can't.
Nobody can do it.
Yeah, I think
Dom?
Okay, I'll move quickly so we have more time.
Don't bring up quality.
So paying for what we value, we often say that we collaborate with many other states that are designing or refining their existing formulas, and this is one thing we often tell them right away. Our formula is going to look different because we pay for what we value, and that's our recommendation to them. So that's why there's quite a bit of differences between states, as we saw in some of those slides. Historically, funding was primarily based on enrollment change, new academic programs, and equity adjustments. Performance funding was established in 2003 with a research incentive, which was 1%. It was all new money. There was no reallocation. Reallocation began in 2009. This is getting hard to see as we add more biennia, but this is the commissioner's favorite chart. As you see, the last 3 biennia has been relatively consistent. For 2017-19, the only 2 changes we made from 15-17 were to remove the institutionally defined metric and to add 18 to 29 certificates to overall degree completion and at-risk degree completion. The big 3, as I call them, under completion, overall, on time, and at-risk represent 90% of the formula. And the important thing to know about these metrics is that they're stackable. So you can get, an institution can receive a payment for a student that actually qualifies for all 3. And we only pay in this formula resident undergraduate students in Indiana. So that's the focus for 60% of Hoosiers with a credential beyond high school.
Who would they get credit? Who pay for it? Who pays for masters and doctoral programs?
Oh, resident.
On the definition of on-time graduate,
Yes.
it's same college, same degree.
Correct.
Right.
Is that right?
Mhm.
So when I convince a political science major for the error of his ways to become an economics major and graduate in 4 years, we don't get credit for that.
No, they have the same degree level. Degree level.
Degree
Same
level.
degree level.
Bachelor's degree.
Same degree level.
Same degree level.
Yeah.
Interesting hypothetical.
What would add the value of this?
Mission differentiation is something we've talked about. All institutions are eligible for those 3 overall on-time and at-risk. The remaining metrics are separated by the mission of the institution. And this is the results sheet that Chris alluded to earlier. This is a 5-year change that we're seeing. We're seeing significant change in all the metrics. You'll see persistence, except for persistence, and the reason being is that it's an account-based metric and it's very closely tied to enrollment. That is one that we have on the list to possibly change to a rate. In fact, we plan to change it to a rate.
So you understand what he's saying, that maybe because the enrollment has gone down, it's hard to show any improvement in persistence. So if we just done it by account where we are offering that, probably should be done on a rate basis to look at.
And this shows the percent of operating dollars that have been funded through performance funding over time, even though the formula in fiscal year 19 is 6.5%, some 26.7% of all of the institution dollars have been funded through performance. So this shows some significant growth in that, and that's what the commissioner mentioned earlier. Looking ahead, as Commissioner Lovers mentioned, we'll be visiting institutions and meeting with their executive teams to talk about performance funding as well as our strategic plan. And then fiscal staff will follow up with a visit to the institutions to work with their fiscal staff to kind of exchange ideas and show them what we're thinking. And ultimately, by the end of the year, we will present a list of recommendations to you. Any questions for me, or I'm sure?
And I'm guessing that that last slide will include an accentuated bullet around quality.
Right, that is on the list.
How to measure that. And, you know, it probably goes without saying, but just, Chris, to your point about the competitiveness of American higher education, you know, there's a lot written about that in various ways. One would think if there's observation that our quality is not where it needs to be and that it's better in other locations geographically, then there's a measurement of that in some capacity. So there ought to be a way to translate from what we're looking at to say that American education is falling behind, we ought to, how do you measure that? I mean, in what way is it falling behind, and how do we reflect that in what we're doing here?
It's only a few disciplines we're looking at, that all that is made from a few disciplines.
Right.
It can be STEM.
I'm sorry, even if we're looking at just those disciplines, that really is based on the start building towards looking out.
Okay, very good. Good discussion. Thank you both, Martha. Thank you so much for being here and for your good work. Next up, Indiana College Completion Report. Everybody, I think, is aware that each year we publish an annual comprehensive picture of college completion in order to advance our overall efforts towards educational attainment. Dr. Stacy Townsley is going to give us a preview of this year's report, which is going to come out here in just a few weeks.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So yes, we're putting on the final touches of our 4th annual completion report, and I'm happy to share with you today some of the key data points. About the report, the purpose of the report is, one, to track progress towards our completion goals, to focus attention on achievement gaps, and again, to show a bigger picture of student success. And my presentation will touch on each of these areas. But first, a little bit about the data. Again, primarily coming from the Indiana Publics, the enrollment and degree completion data. And we ping that against the National Student Clearinghouse so that we are able to capture those who graduate elsewhere in the state or across the country. For the most part, we're focusing on those first-time, full-time degree-seeking undergraduates who are actually entering their first semester as full-time students. They may switch later on, but they're entering the first time as full-time students. This report focuses on the 2016 graduates, and so that's looking back for our on-time completion rates. We're looking at fall 2012 entrance at the 4-year institutions, and fall 2014 for those who are entering at the 2 years. And as we look at our extended 6-year graduation rates, we're looking at those who entered in fall 2010. And I also wanted to note that for this 4th annual report, we've sought to provide greater context in terms of degree completion trends by including information around student behaviors on credit completion and persistence from first year to second year. So again, with the on-time graduation rate, we're looking at the percentage of students who completed at the same campus or system at the same degree level at which they started. And so for 4 years, we're looking at those pursuing a bachelor's, and 2 years, associate degree or a longer-term certificate. And as this chart indicates, we see improvement in on-time rates across all campus types, particularly since 2013. Now, the percentages in the charts are rounded up for simplicity, but since 2013, we see that, for example, main campuses, which it's a label that we use to identify those, I think it's ISU, BSU, IU, Purdue, and USI, so 5. So main campuses improved by approximately 6 percentage points. Our non-main campuses, which are your regionals and your metropolitan, on average showed the highest increase of 8 percentage points since 2013. And your 2 years increased by about 5 percentage points. And I wanted to note for comparison, Indiana's nonprofit 4-year institutions had a relatively stable on-time graduation rate of between 58 to 59%. So from 2015 to 2016, we see improvement at almost every institution. The largest 1-year gains were made by 2 regionals, IU East and IU Northwest. And where I could on this particular chart, I put the actual graduation rates. You do have pages and pages of percentages as a handout where all of these are listed as well. And also highlighted on this chart are the 2 institutions that have met the state goal of 50% on-time graduation rate, and those are our 2 flagships. But over a longer time horizon from 2011 to 2016, we see gains at all institutions. And this chart shows the level of improvement over 5 years with 2 regionals, IU East and IU Kokomo, and 3 main campuses, Purdue, West Lafayette, Ball State, and USI, seeing the most gains. And so for last year's completion report, we examined which students were graduating on time, and our analysis pointed to 2 key behaviors related to intentionality. And these are staying within the same general area of study, what we often refer to as a meta major, such as STEM, arts and humanities, business. And the other factor was staying enrolled full-time or even on time. So at the 4 years, for those who stay within the same meta major, the likelihood of graduating on time is about 1.5 or nearly twice as likely as those who did not stay within the same meta major throughout. At 2 years, students were 6 times as likely to graduate on time. For enrollment, our data clearly show that those who are enrolled exclusively full-time every semester are much more likely to graduate on time, 2 to 4 times as likely, compared to those who mix or switch between full-time and part-time. And again, I think this was mentioned earlier, our full-time technically means 12 hours or more, but an on-time pace requires an average 15 hours a semester or 30 credits per year, which could include pre-college credits such as dual credit or summer classes. So the Commission and campus partner efforts to promote on-time 15 to finish pace has shown results, as you know. This chart indicates, for example, an increasing percentage of freshmen are attempting and earning 30 or more credit hours their first year, and scholars who since fall of 2013 have been required to take at least 30 credit hours to maintain their aid are posting the highest gains. While we don't yet have degree completion data for the most recent starters at 4 years for scholars under this new rule, at 2-year campuses, we've seen scholar on-time completion rates jump 6 percentage points over the last 3 years. So from 2012 to 2014 starters. So the completion rates have jumped from approximately 6 to 12%. And higher increase than other low-income groups, and the overall cohort, for example, Frankel, Bannon, and Pell, is about 6 to 8%, and all students 12 to 15%. I didn't have that data on the chart, but I wanted to share it with you. So another early indicator of intentionality, of course, is your second-year persistence. And of course, it is important to stay consistently enrolled if you're going to graduate on time. And so to that end, we've introduced this metric into the completion report as context, and you might recall that we also have this metric in our college readiness reports. Overall, the data show that student persistence rates are fairly stagnant, to be honest, and in some instances have decreased slightly. This chart shows the data from all public institutions for the fall 2014 cohort. And primarily, I wanted to highlight the differences among groups. Scholars and Pell, the students within the Scholars and Pell groups are mutually exclusive, so the Pell does not include scholars. You'll note that there's an 11 percentage point difference between the minority, which captures Black and Hispanic students, to all students. Now, national data also shows similar trends. They're again fairly stagnant. And I will be coming back to persistence data later on in the presentation because it's quite key. So on the whole, the improvement we've seen in on-time graduation rates is also evident across all of race, ethnicity, and low-income groups that we monitor. But as you know, we continue to see gaps in on-time graduation rates for minorities and low-income students. This chart highlights data for the 2016 graduates, and as you can see, the gap is especially notable for Black students, regardless of campus type. Last year, we introduced a more refined achievement gap measure using likelihood, which is a ratio statistic, rather than just examining differences in percentage points. The AG measure is a way of comparing completion rates that help us more accurately identify where we are in terms of the actual achievement gap and to track progress over time. And as you know, Indiana's goal is to close the gap by 2025. The chart on the left shows where we are currently. If we maintained our current pace from that arrow, fall of 2014, we'd only close the gap by 2/3 in 2025, or by 67%. The table on the right shows the number of institutions that are on track, making some progress, and not on track to close the achievement gap by 2025.
I'm sorry, what is the achievement gap?
So it's just a ratio of the underrepresented group over the majority group. So your minorities over your white population. The percentage of the on-time percentage. And our measure is also, we do some weighting as well, and then the average progress is since fall 2005. On the back of the handout, we do have a table of the actual institutions that are within those buckets. Wanted to highlight here that the gap for low-income students follows similar patterns, and here we're seeing the actual percentages, the graduation rates. And again, as we look at this AG measure of progress, we see on the left the chart, and again the arrows pointing to fall 2014, that we're already above, we're a little bit higher already with the low income than we were for the minority. And then if we maintain the current pace, by 2025, we'd be closer to closing the gap about 80% of the way than we would be for minorities. The table on the right, however, suggests that more individual institutions are struggling to make progress toward closing the low-income gap. So a few factors to consider as we think about the achievement gap. I mentioned earlier that I would come back to the issue of persistence rates because they have a significant impact on the achievement gap. With regards to the minority achievement gap, for example, consider that at four-year publics, as it's pointed out on the slide, the dropout rate for Black students is almost double that of whites at the end of 6 years. Hispanics are somewhere in the middle at 31%. And of those who drop out, 1/3 do so after the first year. Now looking at our data, we can see that those who did not persist typically have poorer academic performance. The average GPA is much lower than those who do go on their sophomore year. This is regardless of whether or not they were in remediation. And that also holds true at two-year publics. While we do see higher dropout rates overall, and the differences are somewhat less pronounced, of those who drop out, 2/3 do so after the first year. So that first year is critical. Also, I mean, we've heard this from our partner campuses again. Some of the information that's coming out in research across the U.S. There was a recent study, I believe, I can't remember offhand, which was the Journal of Higher Education. They did a study out of Texas that showed that more than half of the racial achievement gap was explained by pre-college factors. On the flip side of that means, about 40% of those factors are within the control of the college. And so what does that mean? What are campuses doing to help those students who are traditionally at risk? Some other studies reviewed by the National Science Foundation of, I believe, about 61 studies found that there was a strong positive impact with interventions done by campuses on the student's sense of belonging, around their support and growth mindset. It had a strong positive impact on GPAs and persistence. So as our campus partners know, there are things that we can be doing. The persistence rate, I think, is key. I think it's something that we need to be looking at critically.
Could you share some of those pre-college factors?
Offhand, I don't have them written down, but I will be happy to share the article if I can pull it from the website, and I'll point you in the right direction.
Thank you very much.
So in addition to tracking progress towards on-time graduation goals, the completion reports also show a bigger picture of student success to include longer time horizons. We look out 6 years, and we look at those who are completing at different degree levels, who are transferring and completing at other institutions. We know, for example, that extended completion rates capture more of those students who are switching, again, between full-time and part-time, or stopping out, who are maybe completely changing their program of study, switching to a completely different meta major, and those who decide to pursue a higher or lower credential than they initially intended to do. So as this graph shows, extended completion rates, the 6-year rates for students entering the fall 2005 through fall 2010 are on the whole fairly steady. They are improving, but at a much slower rate than your on-time rates. And at some institutions, we even see small declines, and I'll get to that in just a moment. Nevertheless, since 2011, we've seen on average in campuses extended rates improving by about 3 percentage points, non-main campuses by approximately 6 percentage points, and 2 years around 3 percentage points. For reference, I've also included on this chart data for Indiana private nonprofits and national 4-year and 2-year publics so that you can see where we are in relation to that. And their rates are holding fairly steady as well. So with regards to this relatively stagnant or even slightly declining completion rates at individual institutions, again, all of that data is in the handout that I gave you. We don't know for sure exactly what's happening, but I would say that a combination of several factors are likely, including the fact that the intentional behaviors that drive on-time completion are not necessarily holding true for those who take longer to complete, which makes it harder to move the needle on these extended rates. Another factor would be, the economy is improving, so students are dropping out and going into the workforce, especially at your 2-year institutions, for example. And remember, we're also looking at older data. These are folks who entered in 2010 for the most recent graduation. And so, again, many of these started before a lot of the targeted student success initiatives really took hold on campuses. So, but regardless, the trend should drive the question of what's happening on these campuses. This chart provides a sense, again, of the bigger picture, what is happening with students at the 6-year mark, not only with their graduation. So the dark green is those who are graduating the same campus, same degree. That's your on-time graduation rate. Your lighter green is those who are captured in this extended completion rate. They're graduating at the same or a different campus, at the same degree or a different degree level. It's interesting that as you look at this, the percentages are fairly stable across the different institutions in terms of the number of the additional percentage of students who are being captured in that extended rate. The dark orange represents the percentage of students who are enrolled somewhere still at the 6-year mark. And the lightest color represents those who are no longer enrolled, those who are dropouts, or as we refer to them as stopouts. And again, that stopout population is your you can go back population. It is your workforce ready grant population. One thing that I've been wanting to do this for a really long time. I think we're finally at a place that we can move forward with this. We're going to be doing a supplemental study to the completion report, looking at those who are transferring and the success around transfer. And I think it's a timely question, especially as we consider all of these other initiatives across the state, as we look at those who, and for this study, we will not be looking at those who are just entering as full-time students. We will be looking at all of those and then figuring out pathways with the transfer. 3 key questions we'll be looking at again is, of course, just the basics. How many are transferring, or where are they going? What, again, are their outcomes and how do they compare to non-transfers? And then what are some of their characteristics? Who are these students? And again, once we have the report all wrapped up, it'll be out there for your review. We'll be sure to forward that. We also have an accompanying dashboard that has a lot more data to look at across various different time horizons and some additional metrics that might be of interest. Any questions? You're my easy group today. Thank you. Thank you.
Great report. Thank you very much, Stacy. Any additional questions for her? Please just respond directly. Let's see. Where did I lose my place? Sorry. Okay, we're ready to move on to academic degree programs. First up, we have the Bachelor of Science in Engineering, BSc in Engineering, to be offered by Indiana State University. This is open for full discussion. I'd like to invite President Daniel Bradley and Provost Michael Licari, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, from Indiana State to present the program, and then we'll follow up with Dr. Sauer with the staff recommendations. So, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be before the commission again. Thank you for having me. The discussion earlier today was very interesting. I'm here today to ask for your approval for a program that we think helps us meet our strategic goals and your strategic goals and meets many of the goals of the state and goals that our students have. And that is a Bachelor of Science in Engineering. When I look at this program, I looked at it from a number of different ways. First, what's the value it provides to the state of Indiana? There's demonstrated workforce needs, particularly in the area of generalist engineers, and that's the type of engineer we expect to graduate. 10% job growth nationally and locally for those types of engineers, as demonstrated in letters of support that are in our packet. It really does not duplicate, at least in terms of the mission and goals of the program, what's going on at other institutions, particularly West Lafayette. Looking at it from the value of the student, why would a student want to pursue this type of degree? I think two biggies. First, above average job opportunities, and secondly, above average salaries, with salaries starting in the 50,000 plus range and topping out many times well over 100,000. It also adds value to our College of Technology. We have a number of programs in engineering technology, a different field but very closely aligned. They share much of the same laboratory equipment and laboratory efforts. So there's a lot of overlap and duplication of equipment that can be used to reduce the overall cost. Another important one for us is that there are really no good pathways for education of engineering technology faculty other than engineering. And so when you have a PhD in engineering, you'd like to have engineering students as well as engineering technology students. So we feel and have pretty good data that would say we'll have an easier time attracting faculty in the future when we have both engineering technology and engineering programs. As I said, the other big point is we think that this will help us grow overall enrollment, and because of shared facilities will help moderate costs. The value to the university itself is it will help us grow our overall enrollment. As I think many of you are aware, our enrollment is up close to 30% over the last 8 or 9 years. We need that to continue in order to continue to prosper. The way we will do that is making sure we provide value to our students, provide programs that our students need. There is a very moderate cost to benefit ratio for this program, and I only jokingly say that we decided not to add any more healthcare programs, but we'd add engineering instead because engineering is so much cheaper than healthcare programs. And that's only partially tongue-in-cheek. It does also meet one of our highest institutional goals, and that is of creating or graduating people who are workforce ready. From a cost point of view, we have estimated that we would approach about 180 students in the program within 5 years. We actually feel that we would cash flow the program if we only achieve about a third of those students. So it's a win-win-win-win situation, and we hope that you can see yourselves to approve it. I have our Dean of Technology, Bob English, our Associate Provost for Curriculum, Susan Powers, and our Provost, Michael Kari. Any of us would be happy to try and answer any questions that you want.
Thank you, President Bradley. Any questions from the group at this point in time for President Bradley or anyone else? Yeah, Chris.
President Bradley, I hate to go here, but since we just had the conversation on on-time completion and completion rates, Indiana State has improved a little bit over the 11 to 2016 time frame, if I understand this correctly, 22% to 25.9%. Same campus, same degree. And when we look at extended 6-year, it's down in that period of time.
Yes, sir.
And then when we look at it with regard to, I thought was a strength of yours, was the minority communities. The African American has gone from 8.6 to 11.2. Hispanic has gone down, others up considerably, and white's gone up considerably.
I think that there's a big factor that hasn't been considered in the on-time completion category that I would encourage you to look at going forward, and that is the number of credits that students bring with them when they come to the university. My expectation is that Indiana students going to West Lafayette and Bloomington bring with them upwards of 30 credits. So when they try to finish in 4 years, they have 3 years worth of work to complete. When students come to Indiana State, the average one has 3 credits of dual credit, and therefore they have 4 years worth of work to finish in 4 years. And I'm sure that that's correlated with the wealth of the school district. So students coming from Gary or from IPS have a huge disadvantage in terms of getting dual credit completed. And therefore they have a big disadvantage in terms of completing in 4 years. I think, just trying to remember all your comments, the Hispanic numbers, probably a statistical artifact, but our Hispanic population has increased by, I think, something like 400% in my time. So from a very small number to something significantly larger. There's 2 things that results from that. One is the mix of students. My guess is the economic background of the students from 8 or 9 years ago is substantially different than the economic background of the students of today. I think the same is probably true with African Americans. But if we look at all of the increased number of on-time degrees, my off-the-cuff estimate would be 75% of those are due to dual credit or college challenge, and 25% due to the efforts on all of our campuses to make it happen. I expect that we will see continued improvement, but what we've run into is a theoretical maximum right now where students have to finish 15 credits a semester nominally to graduate in 4 years, particularly if they don't bring any dual credit with them. And currently, only something in the very low 30% range of our students do that. So we have a major effort trying to increase the number of students taking 15 credits. But in part because of their economic situation, they have jobs, and in part because of where they went to school and their economic situation, they have difficulty carrying a high load. And so we will not likely achieve anything close to the on-time degree levels that, say, much more prosperous institutions achieve.
John?
Yeah, usually, or I'm not familiar, but usually you get a specialty in reading your background information in mechanical or civil or electrical, but this is going to be sort of a general mix of all those.
Yes, intentionally, that's true. And I think the real answer for that, and the reason that there is a demand for those types, is that there are a significant number of companies or locations where you are likely to be the only engineer in the place. And so, as a generalist, you can solve first level problems regardless of where they come from, because you've had a more general education. When I look at today's workforce needs, we are definitely a workforce economy that needs generalists. You know, I think if you go back to the beginning of my career, it was really the era of the specialists and the highly specialized people. Today, if I want a specialist at Indiana State, I go hire a consultant, pay him a high level, get what I can from them, and send them away. We need people who can do a lot of different things, do something different every day. And that's really what this kind of individual is created for.
They're qualified to know if you need a chemical or an electrical. They're in a position to find that person, right?
I think that's in part true, that they can do some diagnostics, but they can also solve some of the problems that maybe a chemical or a mechanical or a civil could do if they were available, but you don't. And day one you have a civil problem, day two you have a mechanical problem, day three you have electrical. You don't want to wait or pay the cost of bringing in a highly specialized individual when someone with a more general education could do it as well.
Other questions for President Bradley or the team from Indiana State? All right, maybe Ken, would you be willing to come up, and not that we're done with questions, but would you be willing to give staff recommendation? That'd be great. I know
Yes,
you guys have dug into all this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would point out that the extensive analysis that was done 2 years ago in connection with the Indiana University engineering programs in many ways underscored the need for engineers and the importance of engineering expertise in the 21st century. So I think in many ways the analysis done for this program is very consistent with that. In addition, Indiana State has consulted with both Purdue and the University of Southern Indiana with respect to their engineering programs, and in both cases there were some constructive comments that were offered. Then to Commissioner Pop's question about general engineering, I would point out that the Commission approved a general engineering program for the University of Southern Indiana back in 2002. And indeed, that program proved to be very successful. The enrollments grew, had good employment outcomes for its graduates. Now, eventually, as you may recall, not too long ago, the Commission did approve some discipline-specific engineering programs for USI, but it took more than a decade for that to occur. I'm not saying anything about what might happen with Indiana State, except that the staff is confident and has been assured by the university that this general engineering program would stay in place indeed for some time. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would offer the staff a recommendation, which is that the Commission approve the BSE in engineering to be offered by Indiana State University. And please respond to any questions.
Question for Ken?
Yeah, I guess I'd ask a question. As I recall, and I got here in the aftermath of that, of 2002, and I heard there was a lot of hue and cry about the opening of that engineering program at the time, a lot of objection. It was approved. students to that engineering program. We've also been very concerned here about mission differentiation and mission creep. In the staff's opinion, this is not mission creep. This is not, we're not violating the kinds of things we've talked about doing, making sure we stay disciplined on.
Well, I would say no. Back in 2002, I think there was less of a strong opinion about, I think, the need for expanding the availability of engineering programs than there is now. I do think the use of that outside consultant, you may recall 2 years ago, I think was made a persuasive case that it would be appropriate to expand the engineering programs. I think selectively. The Indiana University Bloomington program was very selectively cast. It was not, and the Commission's recommendation explicitly was not to expand graduate programs and undergraduate programs at Bloomington greatly. I mean, it was couched very carefully. I think in this case, we do have a general engineering program, which, as President Bradley has indicated, I think there is a demand for that. And I would also stress that coming off a very intensive conversation 2 years ago about IU engineering, one of the things we were very careful to do was to confirm that Indiana State had in fact reached out to other institutions that do have a strong mission in engineering. And in the case of Purdue, for example, the Purdue raised no objection whatsoever to Indiana State. In fact, had offered some constructive comments in support of their program. And the same is true of USI. I think USI offered some constructive comments given the fact that they started their engineering offerings as a general engineering program. So I think from a staff perspective, we're very comfortable with adding an engineering program to the programmatic offerings of Indiana State.
Any other comments? Anybody else from the Academic Affairs Quality Committee have any specific comments beyond what John?
Because I made this argument, as you recall, when we talked about IU and USI, I feel like it may get here with my institution. It's reminded that engineering, particularly in general engineering, has become so much more important to other areas and other disciplines that lots of programs that are currently at ISU will benefit significantly from having this program on campus.
And the applied nature of other parts of academia can be benefit, right? Okay, any other comments? I would entertain a motion for approval as stated in the recommendation and approved or recommended by the staff.
John's already gone.
Oh, thank you. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same. Okay, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We're going to lose our form here fast, so we need to really.
We're okay for.
Can I leave or not?
Hi.
I get to stay. Holy cow.
Well, let me see. We don't want to have these people wait all day. So we've got 1, 2. Can you wait 5 minutes?
Can you wait? Yeah, just a couple. Expedited action. I tell you what. Let's do the. Well, no, we better stand track.
7 we need to have. 7 we need to have.
7's enough.
8, I believe, I can check.
Okay. Here.
Yeah, we're fully staffed now.
Let's go on and move it quickly.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so expedited action, 3 academic programs, Bachelor of Architecture to be offered by Ball State University, which we've talked a lot about, Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Science and Applied Behavior Analysis, Autism, and the Bachelor of Arts in Management of Human Organization to be offered by Indiana University Bloomington. Thank you. It's been moved before I even read them.
Second.
All right, thank you. Any comments, questions, concerns about any of the expedited actions? Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same. All right, thank you. Capital projects for full discussion.
Mini discussion.
Mini discussion.
Mini full discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. Any questions?
No question.
So moved.
Committee's right, Leonard. The committee's right.
Yes, thank you.
Move approval.
Second.
The committee unanimously approved the full discussion item here. All right, any questions? Hearing none. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Great presentation, Tom. Capital projects for expedited action, IU, the Mets Grillion, I never know how to say that word, renovation and relocation, and Ivy Tech Terre Haute, the precision agriculture, again, an expedited action approved by the committee. I will entertain a motion for approval. Any other comments, questions, concerns? Hearing none. All in favor say aye. 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 Opposed, same sign. Okay. Bilateral reciprocity agreements. We had a lengthy discussion in the morning work session, and the intention is to approve both renewals of both those Indiana and Kentucky and Ohio bilateral reciprocity agreements as they are currently stated and have been stated, and with the intent that over the next year plus we will take a heavy and hard look at our reciprocity, trying to gather better data around the performance of them and whether they're aligned to where we're headed, where we want to be headed. So I would entertain a move for approval of both of those. Okay, talk about railroad.
This is the time to get something done.
Any questions or comments? Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Okay, former FBI Commissioner Comey, what are your comments for that? Oh yeah, the spending plan, sorry, which again we talked at length about this morning. Commission for Higher Education 2018 spending plan, again you have all the background, we talked at length. Entertain motion?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign, thank you. All right, the rest of you may. Wow.
Remember, the length of our meeting has to do with how many questions are asked.
Yeah,
Hal. Was it something I said? All right, where am I here? I've completely lost control of this meeting. You can find information items beginning on page 87 of your agenda book. Any old or new business? Are we good at the order?
Should we create a new committee with all those that just left?
That's a nice thought, yes. Quality, yeah. All right, no meeting in July. We will have our next meeting of the commission on August 10th in New Albany. And something I forgot to mention in my report, which I completely skipped over, we will be convening the nominating committee here in July in leading up to the August meeting where we annually vote on officer positions as well as any approvals of new commission members. We'll hopefully have a new commission member from the faculty. So again, let's end with a big thank you to John Conant and a piece of cake and a thank you for all you've done, and we look forward to your continued service to Indiana State and higher education in Indiana. This meeting is adjourned.